The spring tornado of 1885 tore across the Arizona Territory with the wrath of ancient gods, turning the peaceful desert landscape into a hellscape of flying debris and screaming winds that could strip flesh from bone. For Rebecca Mitchell, a widowed frontier doctor struggling to establish the territory's first medical clinic for Apache and settler alike, survival meant barricading herself against nature's fury and praying her small adobe building could withstand the storm's violence. But on that catastrophic April evening, as the twister's roar drowned out all other sound, she never imagined that finding a half-dead Apache child buried beneath the wreckage of her collapsed barn would ignite a chain of events that would forever alter the balance between two worlds at war and potentially cost her everything when War Chief Thunderbear arrived 48 hours later with 200 painted warriors demanding answers she wasn't prepared to give. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Rebecca Mitchell had always been drawn to broken things that needed healing. At 34, she possessed hands that could set bones with surgical precision and a mind that could diagnose ailments that baffled even trained physicians back east. But it was her heart that had brought her to the Arizona Territory's most dangerous frontier, where Apache raids and settler conflicts created an endless stream of casualties that no one else would treat. The small adobe clinic she had built with her own hands sat at the crossroads between the Apache reservation and the growing settlement of Copper Ridge, positioned deliberately to serve both communities despite the mutual hostility that kept them apart. Rebecca had learned the Apache language from old Miguel Santana, a Mexican trader who had lived among various tribes for decades, and she treated Apache patients with the same care she gave to wounded cavalry soldiers, a practice that earned her suspicion from both sides, but also grudging respect. Her late husband, Dr. James Mitchell, had died 3 years earlier from typhoid fever while treating an outbreak among the reservation Apache. Rather than fleeing back to civilization as everyone expected, Rebecca had remained determined to continue the medical mission they had started together. She had converted their small ranch house into a proper clinic, complete with surgical equipment ordered from Chicago and pharmaceutical supplies that cost nearly everything she owned. The morning of April 15, 1885, began like any other. Rebecca rose before dawn to check on her patients, an Apache woman recovering from a difficult childbirth, an elderly settler with a broken leg, and a young cavalry trooper whose infected gunshot wound required daily cleaning and fresh bandages. The clinic's main room served multiple functions: surgical theater, recovery ward, and Rebecca's living quarters, all rolled into one efficient space. As she prepared breakfast for her patients, Rebecca noticed the unusual quality of the morning light. The sky had taken on a greenish tinge that she had learned to associate with severe weather, and the air felt heavy with the kind of electric tension that made horses nervous and dogs howl. The barometric pressure was dropping rapidly. Her father's old weather glass showed readings she had never seen before. Miguel Santana arrived just after sunrise, his weathered face creased with concern as he helped Rebecca tend to her patients. At 73, Miguel had survived Apache wars, Mexican revolutions, and American territorial disputes by developing an almost supernatural ability to sense approaching trouble. "The birds are flying wrong," he observed in his mixture of Spanish and English, gesturing toward the empty sky. "All the desert animals have gone to ground. Something very bad comes today, Doctora." Rebecca trusted Miguel's instincts more than any official weather forecast. She began preparing the clinic for severe weather, moving her most critical supplies to the interior room that served as her surgery and securing the shutters over every window. The Apache woman, whose name was Gentle Rain, watched these preparations. "With growing anxiety, sky spirits are angry," she said softly in her native tongue, which Rebecca now understood well enough to follow. This feels like the tornado summers when I was a child, when whole villages were swept away. Rebecca had heard stories of the legendary tornadoes that occasionally devastated the southwestern territories, but she had never experienced one personally. The violent thunderstorms and flash floods were dangerous enough. She couldn't imagine weather powerful enough to destroy entire communities. By midday, the temperature had dropped 20 degrees, and the wind began to howl with a sound that seemed to come from the earth itself rather than the sky. Rebecca's patience grew increasingly restless. The animals in her small barn were refusing to eat, and even the hardy desert plants seemed to shrink back from the approaching storm. The first real indication of the tornado's approach came at 3:00 in the afternoon, when Rebecca noticed a strange darkness spreading across the western horizon. It wasn't the normal darkness of storm clouds, but something more ominous, a wall of debris and dust that stretched from the ground to the heavens, moving with the inexorable power of a mountain avalanche. "Madre de Dios," Miguel whispered, crossing himself as he stared at the approaching phenomenon. "I have seen many storms, but nothing like this. We must get everyone to the strongest part of the building immediately." Rebecca helped her patients into the surgery room, which had the thickest walls and no exterior windows. She gathered her most essential medical supplies, knowing that if the clinic was destroyed, these instruments and medicines might be the only thing standing between life and death for anyone injured in the storm. The tornado's roar became audible. While it was still miles away, a sound like 1,000 freight trains racing across the desert simultaneously. The very air seemed to vibrate with the approaching monster's power, and Rebecca could feel the pressure changes in her ears as the storm system's massive low-pressure center approached. As the darkness engulfed her clinic, Rebecca said a prayer for all the souls in the tornado's path, having no idea that her greatest test was still approaching through the swirling chaos outside. The tornado arrived with the suddenness of divine judgment, transforming Rebecca's world from relative calm to absolute chaos in the space of a single heartbeat. The sound was unlike anything she had ever experienced, not just loud, but a physical force that seemed to compress her lungs and make coherent thought nearly impossible. The clinic's thick adobe walls, which had withstood desert heat, flashy floods, and occasional Apache raids, began to shake like paper in the wind. Rebecca huddled with her patients in the surgery room, feeling the entire structure sway and creak as the tornado's outer edges began to tear at the building's roof and exterior walls. "Hold on to each other," Rebecca shouted over the deafening roar, though she doubted anyone could hear her. The Apache woman, Gentle Rain, clutched her newborn baby to her chest while tears streamed down her face. The elderly settler, Tom Harrison, gripped his broken leg splint and mumbled what might have been prayers or curses. Miguel Santana had his arms around the young cavalry trooper, both men's faces set in the grim acceptance of soldiers who had faced death before. The tornado's eye wall struck the clinic with the force of an artillery bombardment. Rebecca felt the building lift off its foundation before slamming back down with a crash that shattered every piece of glass in the structure. The roof began to peel away in sections, exposing them to the full fury of the storm as debris rained down like hail. A massive piece of timber, probably torn from someone's barn miles away, crashed through the surgery room ceiling, missing Rebecca by inches and embedding itself in the floor with the force of a giant spear. The walls began to buckle inward as the tornado's suction tried to pull the entire building apart. "The barn!" Rebecca screamed, realizing that her small livestock barn was being completely destroyed. She could hear her 2 horses screaming in terror before their voices were swallowed by the tornado's roar. The barn had contained not just animals, but also her winter medical supplies and the emergency food stores that kept the clinic functioning during the harshest months. for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. The tornado held Rebecca's world in its grip, shaking everything like a child's toy, before deciding whether to destroy it completely or set it down battered but intact. The pressure changes were so extreme that Rebecca's ears popped repeatedly, and she could taste blood from where she had bitten her tongue during the building's violent shaking. Then, as suddenly as it had arrived, the tornado moved on. The roar faded gradually, replaced by the gentler sounds of settling debris and distant thunder. Rebecca cautiously raised her head, amazed to discover that the surgery room's walls had held, though the roof was completely gone and debris covered everything. "Is everyone alive?" she called out, beginning to take inventory of her patients. Miraculously, none of them had been seriously injured during the tornado's passage, though they were all shaken and covered with dust and debris. Miguel was the first to venture outside, his lifetime of frontier experience making him the natural scout for assessing post-disaster conditions. He returned within minutes, his face grim with the scope of destruction he had witnessed. "The barn is completely gone," he reported, "scattered across half the territory from the look of it. The main clinic building is damaged but standing. The well appears intact. But Doctora—" He paused, his expression troubled. "There is something else, something you need to see." Rebecca followed Miguel outside, stepping carefully through debris that included pieces of buildings, uprooted trees, and personal belongings that had been carried for miles by the tornado's winds. The landscape had been completely transformed. What had been familiar desert terrain now looked like a battlefield, scarred and littered with the remnants of everything the tornado had destroyed in its path. The remains of her barn were indeed scattered across a wide area. But it was what Miguel had found among the wreckage that made Rebecca's breath catch in her throat. Partially buried beneath a section of the barn's roof and covered with debris, a small figure lay motionless in the dirt. At first glance, Rebecca thought it might be a young deer or calf that had been caught in the storm, but as she approached, she realized with shock that it was a human child. An Apache boy, probably no more than 8 or 9 years old, lay unconscious among the wreckage. His traditional clothing was torn and bloody, and a serious head injury had painted half his face crimson. Most alarming, his left leg was bent at an unnatural angle that clearly indicated a severe fracture. "How is this possible?" Rebecca whispered, kneeling beside the injured child. "Where did he come from?" Miguel examined the surrounding debris field, his tracker's eye reading the story written in scattered materials and disturbed earth. "The tornado passed directly through the Apache reservation," he concluded grimly. "This boy was caught in the storm and carried here, probably several miles at least." Rebecca immediately shifted into her medical mode, her personal amazement giving way to professional assessment of the child's injuries. The head wound was serious, but not life-threatening if properly treated. The broken leg would require careful setting and splinting. Most critically, the boy showed signs of severe dehydration and exposure that suggested he had been unconscious for some time before the tornado struck. "Help me get him inside," Rebecca instructed Miguel. "Carefully. That leg fracture could be complicated." They managed to transport the unconscious child into what remained of the clinic's surgery room, where Rebecca immediately began the process of cleaning and treating his injuries. The boy's pulse was weak but steady, his breathing shallow but regular. He was alive, but barely. As Rebecca worked, she couldn't help but notice details about the child that spoke to his identity and background. His clothing was traditional Apache, but of particularly fine craftsmanship, the kind worn by children of important tribal members. The beadwork on his shirt showed patterns that Rebecca recognized as symbols of high status within Apache society. Most telling, he wore a necklace of bear claws and turquoise that marked him as someone of significance. "This is not just any Apache child," Miguel observed, echoing Rebecca's thoughts. "This boy belongs to an important family. Look at the quality of his moccasins, the silver work on his belt. Someone of great power will be searching for him." Rebecca continued her medical treatment, cleaning the head wound and determining that while serious, it had not penetrated the skull. The leg fracture was more complicated, a clean break of the tibia that would require precise setting and careful immobilization. Using techniques learned during her medical training in Boston, she carefully manipulated the broken bone back into proper alignment while the child remained unconscious. As she worked, Rebecca found herself wondering about the circumstances that had brought this Apache child into her care. The tornado had struck with such suddenness that most people would have had little warning. For a child to be caught outside during such a storm suggested either terrible misfortune or some kind of extraordinary circumstances. The boy stirred as Rebecca finished splinting his leg, his dark eyes fluttering open to focus on her face with confusion and fear. He tried to speak, but only managed a weak whisper in Apache that Rebecca couldn't quite understand. "Rest," she said gently in Apache, using one of the phrases Miguel had taught her. "You are safe now. Your injuries are serious, but you will heal." The boy's eyes widened with surprise at hearing his native language from this white woman, but exhaustion quickly overcame his curiosity, and he drifted back into unconsciousness. Miguel had been watching this interaction with growing concern. "Doctora," he said quietly, "if this boy is from an important Apache family, as his clothing suggests, his disappearance will not go unnoticed. When they discover he is missing, they'll search for him," Rebecca finished, "and when they find him here, in my clinic..." The implications hung heavy in the air between them. Apache families were fiercely protective of their children, and the current tensions between tribal authorities and territorial settlers meant that any unusual circumstances would be viewed with suspicion. If this boy was indeed from a prominent family, his presence in Rebecca's clinic could be interpreted as kidnapping, regardless of the innocent circumstances of his arrival. But looking down at the injured child, Rebecca knew she had no choice. She was a doctor, and he was a patient who needed care. Whatever consequences might follow from that simple fact, as darkness fell over the tornado-ravaged landscape, Rebecca settled in for what she knew would be a long and difficult night. The Apache boy, she had decided to call him Little Bear until she learned his real name, drifted in and out of consciousness, occasionally mumbling words in Apache that even Miguel couldn't entirely understand. The tornado had destroyed most of Rebecca's living quarters, forcing her to set up a makeshift recovery area in the surgery room that had proven most resistant to the storm's fury. She arranged blankets and medical supplies around Little Bear's improvised bed, preparing for the careful monitoring his condition would require. Miguel remained at the clinic, despite Rebecca's assurances that she could manage alone. His frontier instincts told him that the discovery of the Apache child was only the beginning of their troubles, and he wanted to be present if complications arose. "His fever is rising," Rebecca observed during one of her hourly checks. "The head injury may be more serious than I initially thought." She had seen enough head trauma during her years on the frontier to recognize the warning signs of intracranial pressure. The boy's pupils were responding normally, which suggested no immediate brain damage, but the persistent fever indicated possible infection or internal bleeding that couldn't be detected without more sophisticated equipment than her frontier clinic possessed. Throughout the night, Rebecca applied every technique she knew to keep the child stable. She used cold compresses to control the fever, administered carefully measured doses of willow bark extract for pain management, and monitored his vital signs with the precision of a trained surgeon. Miguel assisted by translating the few coherent words the boy spoke during his periods of consciousness. "He keeps asking for his father," Miguel reported during one of these episodes. And he mentioned something about a sacred hunt that was interrupted by the sky spirits. This information added another layer of complexity to the situation. If Little Bear had been participating in some kind of religious ceremony when the tornado struck, his absence would carry spiritual as well as personal significance for his tribe. Apache religious practices were often misunderstood by white settlers, but Rebecca had learned enough about their beliefs to recognize that interrupting a sacred ritual could have serious consequences. As the night progressed, Rebecca found herself thinking about the broader implications of the situation. The tornado had been a natural disaster that affected both Apache and settler communities equally. In the aftermath, there might be an opportunity for the kind of cooperation between the two peoples that her medical practice had been trying to foster. But that optimistic possibility depended entirely on how the Apache community interpreted Little Bear's presence in her clinic. If they saw her as his rescuer and healer, the incident might indeed promote better relations. If they viewed her with suspicion, as someone who had somehow caused his injuries or taken advantage of his vulnerability, the consequences could be catastrophic, not just for Rebecca personally, but for all the progress toward peace that had been made in recent years. By dawn, Little Bear's condition had stabilized somewhat. His fever had broken during the early morning hours, and he was able to remain conscious for longer periods. More importantly, he seemed to recognize Rebecca as someone trying to help him rather than a threat to be feared. "Thank you," he said, clearly in English during one lucid moment, surprising both Rebecca and Miguel with his command of the language. "My father taught me the white man's words. He said someday they might save my life." Rebecca felt a surge of hope at this communication. If Little Bear could explain the circumstances of his arrival to his own people, it might prevent the kind of misunderstandings that could lead to conflict. But her optimism was tempered by the realization that an Apache child who spoke fluent English suggested a family deeply involved in tribal settler relations, which meant his father was likely someone of considerable influence and power. As the sun rose over the debris-strewn landscape, Rebecca prepared herself for whatever the day might bring. Little Bear was alive and improving, but she knew that his rescue was only the first chapter in what was likely to be a much more complex story. She had no way of knowing that 40 miles away, War Chief Thunder Bear had already discovered his son's absence and was gathering 200 of his finest warriors for a search that would forever change the relationship between the Apache Nation and the white settlements of Arizona Territory. The tornado had ended, but the real storm was about to begin. The second day after the tornado brought with it a clarity that was both blessing and curse. Little Bear's condition had improved dramatically overnight. His fever had broken completely. The swelling around his head wound had begun to subside, and he was able to sit up and take small amounts of food. But with his recovery came the full realization of the gravity of their situation as the boy began to speak more freely about who he was and what his disappearance would mean. "My name is Swift Running Water," he told Rebecca in surprisingly fluent English, his young voice carrying a dignity that seemed far beyond his 8 years. "My father is Thunder Bear, war chief of the Chiricahua Band. We were performing the sacred eagle ceremony when the sky spirits grew angry and sent the great wind." Miguel's weathered face went pale at this revelation. "Thunder Bear, was not just any Apache leader. He was one of the most powerful and feared war chiefs in the entire Southwest, a man whose very name could empty frontier settlements and send cavalry units scrambling for reinforcements. He had earned his reputation through a combination of brilliant military strategy and absolute ruthlessness toward anyone who threatened his people. "Dios mío," Miguel whispered. "Thunder Bear's son. Of all the Apache children who could have been blown into our lives by that tornado, it had to be the one whose father could start a war with a single word." Rebecca continued her examination of Swift Running Water's injuries, trying to maintain professional calm despite the fear growing in her chest. The boy's leg was healing properly, but it would be weeks before he could walk normally again. His head injury, while no longer life-threatening, had left him with occasional dizzy spells that made travel dangerous. "Swift Running Water," Rebecca said gently, "your father will be very worried about you. Do you know how we can get word to him that you're safe?" The boy's expression grew troubled. "The sacred eagle ceremony was interrupted by the great wind. This is a very bad sign for our people. My father will think the spirits are angry because of some failure on his part. He will be gathering the warriors, not just to search for me, but to prepare for whatever punishment the spirits might send." This added a spiritual dimension to the crisis that Rebecca hadn't fully considered. In Apache belief, natural disasters were often interpreted as messages from the spirit world, and the interruption of a sacred ceremony by such a powerful tornado would be seen as an omen of immense significance. Thunderbear wouldn't just be looking for his missing son, he would be preparing his people for what he perceived as an impending catastrophe. As if summoned by their conversation, a lone Apache scout appeared on the horizon, moving with the purposeful efficiency that marked an experienced tracker following a trail. Miguel spotted him first, his keen eyes picking out the distant figure against the morning sky. "Rider approaching from the northwest," he reported grimly. "Apache moving fast, following sign. The search has begun." Rebecca felt her heart rate accelerate as she watched the approaching scout. This was the moment she had been dreading. The first contact with Swift Running Water's people, when she would have to explain how an injured Apache child had come to be in her care. Everything would depend on how that explanation was received and whether the scout would listen to reason or simply report back that the missing boy had been found among white settlers. "What should I do?" she asked Miguel, her medical training having provided no guidance for navigating such delicate cultural and political situations. "Tell the truth," Miguel advised. "Show them the boy is being well cared for. Let Swift Running Water speak for himself about what happened. And pray that this scout is someone who values facts over fear." The Apache scout approached Rebecca's damaged clinic with the caution of a predator evaluating potential prey. He was a young man, probably in his early 20s, with the lean build and alert bearing of someone who had spent his life moving silently through dangerous territory. His face was painted with symbols that Rebecca didn't recognize, and he carried both a rifle and traditional Apache weapons with the easy confidence of someone equally skilled with both. Rebecca stepped outside to meet him, keeping her hands visible and her posture non-threatening. She had learned from Miguel that Apache culture valued directness and respected courage, so she decided to address the situation head-on rather than trying to appear innocent or helpless. "I am Rebecca Mitchell," she said in carefully pronounced Apache, using the formal introduction Miguel had taught her. "I am a healer who treats all people. A boy was brought to me by the great wind. He is injured but alive." The scout's eyes widened slightly at hearing his native language spoken by a white woman, but his expression remained carefully neutral. "I am Grey Wolf," he replied in English, apparently deciding that communication would be clearer in her native tongue. "I track the lost son of Thunder Bear." Many signs lead to this place. Swift running water is inside, Rebecca confirmed. He was badly injured when the tornado brought him here, but his wounds are healing. Would you like to see him? Grey Wolf's hand moved instinctively toward his rifle at the mention of Thunderbear's son by name, a reaction that suggested he hadn't been entirely certain what he would find at the end of his trail. The fact that this white woman knew the boy's true Apache name seemed to both reassure and concern him. "How do you know his sacred name?" Grey Wolf asked suspiciously. "White people are not told such things." "He told me himself," Rebecca replied, simply. "He speaks English well and has explained his situation. He said he was participating in an eagle ceremony when the tornado struck." This answer seemed to satisfy Grey Wolf's immediate concerns about Rebecca's knowledge, but it raised new questions about the circumstances of Swift Running Water's arrival. Apache children, especially those from important families, were carefully protected during religious ceremonies. For Thunderbear's son to have been caught in the open during such a powerful storm suggested either extraordinary bad luck or some kind of spiritual significance that Grey Wolf wasn't equipped to interpret. Swift Running Water's voice called out from inside the clinic, speaking rapidly in Apache and clearly recognizing Grey Wolf's voice. The scout immediately moved toward the building, his wariness giving way to obvious relief at hearing his chief's son alive and coherent. Rebecca followed Grey Wolf inside, where Swift Running Water was attempting to stand, despite her medical instructions to remain lying down. The reunion between the boy and the scout was emotional but brief. Grey Wolf quickly assessed Swift Running Water's condition with the practical eye of someone accustomed to evaluating injuries in the field. The conversation that followed was conducted entirely in Apache, with Swift Running Water apparently providing a detailed account of his experiences since the tornado. Rebecca could follow some of the discussion thanks to Miguel's language lessons, but the boy spoke rapidly and used formal phrases that were beyond her current vocabulary. Grey Wolf's expression grew increasingly serious as he listened to Swift Running Water's story. When the boy finished speaking, the scout turned to Rebecca with a mixture of gratitude and deep concern. "Swift Running Water says you saved his life," Grey Wolf said formally. "He says you treated his injuries with great skill and have cared for him like a mother. Thunderbear must know this, but—" He paused, clearly struggling with how to explain the complexity of the situation. "But there will be complications," Rebecca finished for him, understanding the unspoken implications. "Thunderbear comes with 200 warriors," Grey Wolf confirmed grimly. "He believes his son's disappearance is connected to the spiritual disaster of the interrupted ceremony. He is prepared for war if he finds that white people have harmed the boy, but he is also prepared for war if he finds that the spirits demand blood for the broken ritual. Your kindness may not be enough to prevent violence." As Grey Wolf prepared to return to Thunderbear with news of his son's location, Rebecca found herself caught between relief and terror. Swift Running Water was safe and would soon be reunited with his father, which should have been the best possible outcome. But the scout's warnings about Thunderbear's spiritual concerns and military preparations suggested that the boy's rescue might only be the beginning of a much larger crisis. "How long before Thunderbear arrives?" Rebecca asked, trying to assess how much time she had to prepare for what could be either a peaceful reunion or a violent confrontation. "He follows one day behind me," Grey Wolf replied. 200 warriors move more slowly than one scout, but they travel fast when Thunderbear leads them. They will arrive tomorrow at sunset. Swift Running Water had been listening to this exchange with growing anxiety. Despite his young age, he clearly understood the political and spiritual implications of his situation better than Rebecca had initially realized. As the son of a war, "Oh, Chief," He had been raised with an acute awareness of how individual actions could affect entire communities. "Grey Wolf," Swift Running Water said urgently in English, apparently wanting Rebecca to understand his words. "You must tell my father that the White Healer woman is protected by powerful medicine. The great wind brought me to her not as punishment, but as a test of whether whites and Apache can help each other. This is what the spirits intended." Rebecca was amazed by the boy's sophisticated interpretation of events, but Grey Wolf looked troubled by this spiritual analysis. "That is not for me to decide," the scout replied carefully. "Thunder Bear must speak with the medicine men about the meaning of these events. I can only report what I have seen, that his son lives because of a white woman's healing skills." As Grey Wolf prepared to depart, Rebecca made a decision that surprised even herself. "Tell Thunder Bear that he and his warriors are welcome to make camp near my clinic while Swift Running Water completes his healing," she said formally. "I will continue to treat his son's injuries, and perhaps we can discuss how our peoples might help each other in the future." Both Grey Wolf and Miguel stared at Rebecca in amazement. Inviting 200 Apache warriors to camp within sight of white settlements was either an act of extraordinary courage or suicidal madness, and none of them were entirely sure which. "Are you certain of this invitation?" Grey Wolf asked carefully. "Thunder Bear is not known for peaceful negotiations with white settlers." "I'm certain," Rebecca replied, though her voice shook slightly with the magnitude of what she was proposing. "Swift Running Water needs several more days of medical care before he can travel safely. If his father is coming anyway, it makes sense for them to remain here until the boy is fully recovered." Grey Wolf nodded slowly, clearly impressed despite his concerns. "I will carry your words to Thunder Bear. What happens next will depend on his judgment and the counsel of the spirits." After the scout departed, Miguel confronted Rebecca with the obvious question. "Doctora, do you realize what you have just done? You have invited the most dangerous war chief in the southwest to make camp next to white settlements with 200 warriors. The territorial governor will send the cavalry if he learns of this, and there will be a battle that could cost hundreds of lives." Rebecca looked down at Swift Running Water, who was watching her with the intelligent eyes of a child forced to mature too quickly by the dangerous world around him. "Miguel, this boy was brought to me by a tornado that could have killed us all. If that isn't a sign that we're supposed to find a way to work together, I don't know what would be. And if Thunder Bear doesn't see it that way," Miguel pressed, "if he decides that you've somehow caused his son's injuries or that the spirits demand retribution for the interrupted ceremony." Rebecca met Miguel's concerned gaze with quiet determination. "Then I'll face whatever comes, but I won't abandon a patient, and I won't let fear prevent me from trying to do what's right." The remainder of the day passed in tense preparation for Thunder Bear's arrival. Rebecca continued treating Swift Running Water's injuries while trying to ready her damaged clinic for what could be either a peaceful negotiation or a hostile confrontation. Miguel helped her organize medical supplies and repair the worst of the tornado damage, though both of them knew that physical preparations were less important than the psychological readiness required for dealing with Apache warriors. Swift Running Water proved to be an invaluable source of information about his father's likely state of mind and the cultural protocols that would govern their meeting. Despite his youth, the boy possessed a sophisticated understanding of Apache politics and spiritual beliefs that reflected his upbringing as a chief's son. "My father is not cruel," Swift Running Water explained as Rebecca changed his bandages. "But he is responsible for protecting our people, and he has seen too much betrayal from whites. He will test you to see if your kindness is real or if you hope to gain something from helping me." "What kind of test?" Rebecca asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. "He will watch how you treat me when you think he cannot." See, the boy replied seriously, he will listen to how you speak about Apache people when you think no Apache is listening, and he will judge whether your healing skills come from genuine knowledge or from luck that might not last. This last point particularly concerned Rebecca because she knew that her medical training, while extensive for the frontier, was still limited compared to what might be available in major eastern cities. If Swift Running Water's recovery encountered complications, or if Thunderbear's warriors arrived with injuries that exceeded her capabilities, her credibility as a healer could be quickly undermined. Miguel spent the afternoon scouting the surrounding area and developing contingency plans for various scenarios. His experience with Apache culture gave him insights into how the approaching confrontation might unfold, but even he admitted that Thunderbear's reputation made predictions difficult. He is known for doing the unexpected, Miguel warned Rebecca. Sometimes he shows mercy when everyone expects violence, and sometimes he strikes when everyone expects peace. The key is to remain honest and direct. Apache warriors respect courage, even in their enemies. As evening approached, Rebecca found herself thinking about the broader implications of the situation she had created. Word of Thunderbear's approach, with 200 warriors, would inevitably reach the territorial authorities and nearby settlements. If the meeting went badly, she could be blamed for precipitating a conflict that might spread throughout the region. If it went well, she might have helped establish a precedent for peaceful cooperation between Apache and settler communities. But beyond these political considerations, Rebecca realized that she genuinely cared about Swift Running Water's welfare and wanted to see him safely reunited with his family. The boy had shown remarkable courage and maturity during his recovery, and his obvious love for his father had touched something in Rebecca's heart that went beyond professional medical concern. As darkness fell over the tornado-damaged landscape, Rebecca settled in for what she knew would be her last quiet night before Thunderbear's arrival. Tomorrow would bring either triumph or disaster, and there was no way to predict which. But looking at Swift Running Water sleeping peacefully on his improvised bed, she felt confident that she had made the right choice in caring for him, regardless of what consequences might follow. In the distance, barely visible against the starlit horizon, she could make out the faint glow of campfires that suggested Grey Wolf had found Thunderbear's war party and delivered his message. 200 Apache warriors were spending their final night on the trail, preparing for a confrontation that would determine not just Swift Running Water's fate, but possibly the future relationship between their peoples. The tornado had ended 2 days ago, but the winds of change it had set in motion were still gathering strength, and tomorrow would reveal whether they brought destruction or renewal to the Arizona territory. The third dawn since the tornado broke with an eerie stillness that seemed to press against Rebecca's chest like a physical weight. No birds sang in. The devastated landscape, and even the desert wind, had fallen silent, as if nature itself was holding its breath in anticipation of what was to come. Swift Running Water had awakened before sunrise, his young face etched with an anxiety that went far beyond his physical injuries. Today, my father will test not just you, but the spirits themselves, he told Rebecca as she checked his healing wounds. If he believes the tornado was sent to punish our people for some failure, he may decide that you are part of that punishment, no matter how kindly you have treated me. Rebecca had spent the sleepless night considering this possibility, and she had come to a decision that surprised even herself. Rather than simply waiting for Thunderbear to arrive and judge her actions, she would take the initiative and attempt to demonstrate her understanding of Apache culture and her respect for their spiritual beliefs. Swift Running Water, she said. Carefully, would it be appropriate for me to prepare a gift for your father, something that shows I understand the sacred nature of what happened during the eagle ceremony? The boy's eyes widened with surprise and something that might have been hope. "You know about our sacred ceremonies? Miguel has taught me something of your people's ways," Rebecca replied. "I know that the eagle is sacred to the Apache and that its feathers carry great spiritual power. I also know that gifts between peoples should honor the spirits as well as the individuals involved." Swift Running Water was quiet for a long moment, his young mind clearly wrestling with concepts that stretched the boundaries of his cultural experience. No white person had ever demonstrated such specific knowledge of Apache spiritual practices, and certainly none had offered to participate in the ceremonial protocols that governed intertribal relations. "There is something you could do," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper, "but it would be very dangerous for you. If my father believes you are trying to deceive him or mock our ways, the consequences would be severe." Rebecca felt her heart rate accelerate, but her voice remained steady. "Tell me what you think would be appropriate." Swift Running Water explained that in traditional Apache culture, when someone saved the life of a tribal member, especially the child of a chief, a formal ceremony was required to acknowledge the spiritual debt created by this act. The ceremony involved specific gifts, ritual words, and symbolic actions that would transform Rebecca from a stranger into someone connected to the Apache people through bonds of obligation and respect. "But you are not Apache," Swift Running Water concluded. "For you to attempt such a ceremony could be seen as sacred mockery, which would demand harsh punishment. Or it could be seen as proof that the spirits truly intend for our peoples to be connected, which would change everything." The risk was enormous, but Rebecca realized that this might be her only chance to establish meaningful communication with Thunder Bear. If she simply waited for him to arrive and make judgments based on his own assumptions, the outcome would be determined entirely by forces beyond her control. By taking the initiative to demonstrate cultural understanding and spiritual respect, she might be able to influence how the situation unfolded. "Will you help me prepare the ceremony correctly?" she asked Swift Running Water. The boy nodded slowly, his expression mixing fear and admiration for her courage. "I will teach you the words and the actions." But Rebecca, he used her name for the first time, abandoning the formal address he had. "Previously employed, if this goes wrong, even I will not be able to protect you from my father's anger." The hours that followed were unlike anything Rebecca had ever experienced. Swift Running Water, despite his injuries and young age, proved to be a remarkably knowledgeable teacher of Apache ceremonial practices. His instruction went far beyond simple ritual actions to include the spiritual concepts and cultural meanings that gave those actions their power. The eagle ceremony that was interrupted by the tornado was meant to ask the spirits for guidance about our people's future, he explained as Rebecca carefully arranged the ceremonial items they had gathered. When the great wind came, it scattered not just our physical ceremony, but also the spiritual questions we were asking. My father will see my survival and recovery as part of the spirit's answer to those questions. Rebecca had spent the morning gathering materials for the ceremony, from the tornado's debris field. Following Swift Running Water's instructions, she had collected specific types of stones, desert plants, and pieces of wood that had been touched by the storm's power. Each item carried symbolic meaning in Apache tradition, and their combination would create a ceremonial offering that acknowledged both the natural forces involved and the spiritual connections they had created. Miguel watched these preparations with growing alarm. His lifetime of experience with Apache customs told him that Rebecca was attempting something that could either establish her as a person of unprecedented respect among Thunder Bear's people or get her killed for spiritual sacrilege. "Doctora," he said quietly, "are you certain about this path? There are safer ways to approach Thunder Bear as a simple healer who helped his son, nothing more." "That approach might keep me alive," Rebecca replied, as she carefully arranged eagle feathers that swift-running water had been carrying when the tornado struck. "But it won't address the deeper issues that brought 200 warriors to my doorstep. If Thunderbear is truly concerned about spiritual messages from the tornado, then I need to engage with those concerns directly." Swift-running water had been listening to this exchange with the intense focus of a child trying to understand adult complexities that would soon become his own responsibility. "Miguel speaks wisely about the dangers," he said to Rebecca, "but he does not understand what I have seen in my father's heart since my mother died 2 summers ago. Thunder Bear seeks signs that the Apache people have a future that includes more than just war and death. If you can show him such a sign, even the risk will be worthwhile." This revelation about Thunder Bear's personal losses added another dimension to Rebecca's understanding of the situation. The fearsome war chief was not just protecting his son and his tribe. He was a grieving widower, searching for hope in a world that seemed determined to destroy everything he valued. As the afternoon sun climbed toward its zenith, Rebecca completed her ceremonial preparations and began the process of mental and spiritual preparation that swift-running water had described as essential for the ritual's success. The ceremony required not just correct actions and words, but genuine spiritual commitment to the principles it represented. "You must truly believe that the spirits brought me to you for a purpose," Swift-running water instructed. "If there is any doubt in your heart when you speak the ceremonial words, my father will sense it immediately, and the ceremony will become an insult rather than an honor." Rebecca examined her own motivations and feelings, searching for the genuine spiritual conviction that the ceremony required. Did she truly believe that supernatural forces had guided the tornado's path to bring swift-running water to her clinic? Or was she simply trying to manipulate Apache religious beliefs to avoid the consequences of an awkward situation? As she considered these questions, Rebecca realized that her answer mattered less than her genuine respect for the beliefs themselves and her sincere desire to help heal the wounds between Apache and settler communities. Whether or not the spirits had literally directed the tornado's path, the result had created an opportunity for understanding that might never come again. "I am ready," she told swift-running water as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon. Thunder Bear's approach became visible long before the war party itself could be distinguished from the desert landscape. A massive dust cloud rose from the northwest, marking the passage of 200 mounted warriors, moving with the disciplined coordination that made Apache military forces so formidable. Even at a distance of several miles, the sight was both magnificent and terrifying. Rebecca had positioned herself outside the damaged clinic, wearing her finest dress and standing beside the ceremonial arrangement she had prepared under swift-running water's guidance. Miguel stood nearby, armed, but careful to keep his weapons visible and non-threatening. Swift-running water, despite his injuries, had insisted on being present for his father's arrival, and he sat on a chair Rebecca had brought outside, his splinted leg elevated, but his posture proud and alert. As the dust cloud drew closer, individual details became visible through Rebecca's father's old telescope. Thunder Bear rode at the head of the formation on a magnificent black stallion, his bearing regal despite the harsh conditions of desert travel. His warriors flanked him in precise formations that spoke of years of military experience and absolute discipline. Many carried traditional Apache weapons alongside rifles obtained through trade or battle, and their faces were painted with symbols that Rebecca couldn't interpret, but that clearly held ceremonial significance. "They are painted for both war and ceremony," Swift-running water observed, studying his father's approaching forces with an expert eye. "This means Thunder Bear has not yet decided whether he comes as an enemy or as a participant in a sacred ritual. Your ceremony will determine which path he chooses," The war party halted approximately 300 yards from Rebecca's clinic, close enough for detailed observation, but far enough to avoid any appearance of immediate threat. Thunder. Bear himself rode forward alone, his horse stepping carefully through the debris field left by the tornado's passage. As he approached, Rebecca got her first clear look at the man whose decisions would determine not just her own fate, but possibly the future of Apache settler relations throughout the territory. Thunderbear was a man in his early 40s, tall and powerfully built, with the kind of physical presence that commanded attention even in complete silence. His face was marked by traditional Apache tattoos and recent ceremonial paint, but it was his eyes that struck Rebecca most forcefully. Intelligent, grieving, and filled with the weight of impossible responsibilities. He carried himself with the dignity of someone accustomed to making life and death decisions for hundreds of people. But there was also something in his expression that suggested he was tired of the constant conflict that defined his world. He stopped his horse 20 feet from where Rebecca stood and studied her with an intensity that felt like physical examination. His gaze took in every detail of her appearance, her posture, and the ceremonial arrangement she had prepared. Most importantly, his eyes lingered on his son, assessing swift-running water's condition and well-being with the desperate concern of a father who had feared his child was dead. Thunderbear dismounted with fluid grace and approached his son, first speaking rapidly in Apache while examining swift-running water's injuries with hands that were surprisingly gentle despite their obvious strength. The reunion between father and son was emotional but controlled, conducted entirely in their native language and following protocols that Rebecca could observe but not fully understand. After several minutes of intense conversation with swift-running water, Thunderbear turned his attention to Rebecca. His expression was unreadable as he studied her ceremonial preparations, clearly recognizing the Apache elements while trying to assess whether her efforts represented genuine respect or cultural appropriation. "You are the healer, woman," he said in English that was heavily accented but perfectly clear. "My son says you saved his life when the great wind brought him to your door." "I am Rebecca Mitchell," she replied, using the formal introduction Miguel had taught her but speaking in English since Thunderbear had chosen that language. "I am honored to meet the father of swift-running water. Your son has shown great courage during his healing." Thunderbear nodded acknowledgement of her words, but his attention was clearly focused on the ceremonial arrangement she had prepared. "My son also says you wish to perform the sacred debt ceremony, to acknowledge the spiritual connection created when you saved his life. Only if you believe it would be appropriate," Rebecca replied carefully. "I do not wish to offend your traditions or claim honors that are not mine to claim." Thunderbear was silent for a long moment, his gaze moving between Rebecca, the ceremonial items, and his son's expectant face. When he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of someone making a decision that would affect many lives beyond those immediately present. "The tornado that brought my son to you also destroyed the sacred eagle ceremony we were performing," he said slowly. "This was either a punishment from the spirits for some failure on our part, or a message that we must seek new paths for our people's survival. Your ceremony will help us understand which interpretation is correct." Rebecca felt the full weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders. She was about to participate in a religious ritual that could determine whether 200 Apache warriors viewed her as a friend or an enemy, and her performance would be judged by cultural standards she only partially understood. But looking at swift-running water's hopeful face and Thunderbear's weary eyes, Rebecca realized that the ceremony's outcome mattered less than the courage required to attempt it. Whether or not she performed the ritual perfectly, her willingness to risk spiritual offense in order to honor Apache traditions would itself send a message about her intentions and character. "I am ready to begin," she said simply. Thunderbear nodded and signaled to his warriors, who remained in formation but shifted their positions to observe the ceremony while maintaining their readiness for whatever might follow. 200 pairs of eyes focused on Rebecca as she approached the ceremonial arrangement and began to speak the words "swift running water" had taught her. The ritual itself was complex, involving specific movements, spoken acknowledgements of spiritual debt, and the formal presentation of gifts that symbolized her commitment to honoring the connection created by her care of Thunderbear's son. As Rebecca moved through each element of the ceremony, she could feel the weight of scrutiny from both Thunderbear and his assembled warriors. But more than their observation, she felt the genuine spiritual significance of what she was attempting. Regardless of cultural differences, she was participating in a ritual that acknowledged the sacred nature of life, the obligations created by acts of healing, and the possibility that understanding could bridge even the deepest divisions between peoples. When the ceremony concluded, Thunderbear stood in silence for what felt like an eternity, his expression revealing nothing of his judgment. Finally, he spoke words in Apache that Rebecca couldn't understand, but that caused a visible reaction among his warriors. Some nodded approval, others looked surprised, and a few appeared concerned about whatever their chief had decided. "I accept your ceremony," Thunderbear said to Rebecca in English. "The spirits brought my son to a healer who honors our ways. This is a sign that new paths are possible between our peoples." Rebecca felt a wave of relief so powerful that her knees nearly buckled, but Thunderbear wasn't finished speaking. "However," he continued, "accepting your ceremony creates obligations for both of us. You are now connected to the Apache people through bonds that cannot be easily broken. If you prove worthy of this connection, you will find friends and protectors among us. If you prove unworthy, the consequences will be severe." The war chief's words carried both promise and warning, marking the beginning of a relationship that would extend far beyond swift running water's medical recovery. Rebecca had successfully navigated the immediate crisis, but she had also committed herself to a future filled with new challenges and responsibilities that she was only beginning to understand. As evening approached, Thunderbear made a decision that surprised everyone present, including his own warriors. Rather than departing immediately with his recovered son, he announced that the war party would establish a temporary camp near Rebecca's clinic, while swift running water completed his healing, and while Thunderbear himself evaluated the spiritual significance of recent events. "The sacred debt ceremony has created new obligations," he explained to his assembled warriors in Apache, with swift running water quietly translating for Rebecca's benefit. "We must understand what the spirits intend before we decide our next actions." The establishment of the Apache camp transformed the area around Rebecca's tornado-damaged clinic into something resembling a small city. 200 warriors meant not just fighting men, but also the horses, equipment, and support personnel necessary for such a force to function effectively. Within hours, a well-organized encampment had taken shape, with designated areas for cooking, horse care, weapon maintenance, and the various ceremonial activities that marked Apache military culture. Rebecca watched this transformation with fascination and no small amount of trepidation. She had invited Thunderbear's warriors to make camp near her clinic, but the reality of having such a formidable force as her neighbors was both awe-inspiring and terrifying. Every decision she made, every word she spoke, would now be observed and evaluated by people whose cultural standards she was still learning to understand. But she also recognized the unprecedented opportunity that had been created. For the first time in decades, Apache warriors and white settlers were coexisting in close proximity without immediate violence. If this experiment succeeded, it could provide a model for future cooperation between the two peoples. If it failed, the consequences could be catastrophic for everyone involved. As darkness fell over the desert, Rebecca realized that the tornado had indeed changed everything, but in ways far more complex and far-reaching than she had ever imagined. The real test of her courage and wisdom was just beginning. The fourth day dawned with an unexpected sound that made Rebecca sit bolt upright in her makeshift bed. Laughter. Not the harsh, bitter laughter of men preparing for war, but the genuine, carefree sound of children at play. Peering through her clinic window, she witnessed something that seemed impossible just days earlier. Apache children from the war camp were playing games with swift-running Water, who, despite his splintered leg, had managed to hobble outside and join their activities. The sight was remarkable, not just for its normalcy, but for what it represented. Thunderbear had brought his entire extended family group with the war party. Wives, children, elders, and support personnel who transformed the military expedition into something resembling a mobile community. Rebecca had initially seen only the warriors and their weapons, but now she realized that Thunderbear's decision to make camp was far more complex than a simple military pause. "They are testing more than just your character," Miguel observed as he joined Rebecca at the window. "Thunderbear is evaluating whether this place could serve as a bridge between our worlds. Look how the children play together without fear or suspicion." Indeed, swift-running Water was teaching the other Apache children a game that appeared to involve throwing stones at targets marked in the dirt, while they in turn were showing him traditional Apache games that required agility and quick thinking. The boy's recovery had progressed remarkably, his natural resilience accelerated by the joy of being reunited with his people and the stimulation of having playmates again. But it was the adults' behavior that truly intrigued Rebecca. Several Apache women had approached her clinic during the early morning hours, not with weapons or hostility, but with the unmistakable demeanor of mothers concerned about their children's health. Through a combination of gestures, basic Apache, phrases, and swift-running Water's translation, Rebecca learned that the tornado had caused injuries throughout the Apache community as well. "White Dove has a baby who coughs blood," swift-running Water explained, indicating a young woman who held an infant with obvious respiratory distress. "Mountain Cat's daughter burned her hand on a cooking fire, and it grows worse each day. They want to know if the healer woman who saved Thunderbear's son might help their families too." Rebecca felt her heart race with both excitement and apprehension. This was exactly the kind of cross-cultural medical practice she had dreamed of establishing, but the stakes were enormously higher now. If she successfully treated Apache patients, it could cement the alliance Thunderbear seemed to be considering. If her treatments failed or caused harm, it could destroy everything they had built and potentially restart the cycle of violence that had plagued the region. "Tell them I would be honored to examine their children," Rebecca replied to swift-running Water. "But they should understand that my medicine is different from Apache healing traditions. I want to help, but I don't want to interfere with their own spiritual practices." This careful acknowledgement of cultural differences seemed to resonate with the Apache mothers, who nodded approvingly at Rebecca's respectful approach. Within an hour, Rebecca found herself conducting an impromptu medical clinic that served both Apache and settler patients simultaneously, something she had never imagined possible in her most optimistic dreams. The Apache approach to medicine proved to be far more sophisticated than Rebecca had expected. Rather than simply bringing their sick children for treatment by the white doctor, the Apache families wanted to create what they called a healing circle that combined both traditions in a collaborative approach to medical care. Thunderbear himself participated in these discussions, revealing knowledge of medicinal plants and healing techniques that complemented Rebecca's formal medical training. His warrior exterior concealed someone who had studied healing arts extensively, partly from necessity as a military leader who needed to treat battlefield injuries, but also from genuine intellectual curiosity about the mechanisms of health and disease. Apache medicine looks at the whole person, Thunderbear explained as they examined White Dove's sick infant together. Body, spirit, family connections, relationship with the natural world. Your white medicine focuses on the body's machinery, which is also important. Together, perhaps, we can heal things that neither tradition could heal alone. The infant's condition was indeed serious. Pneumonia complicated by what appeared to be an underlying cardiac defect that made breathing difficult even under normal circumstances. Rebecca's medical training provided tools for immediate symptom management, while Thunderbear's knowledge of respiratory herbs offered longer-term therapeutic possibilities that Rebecca's pharmaceutical supplies couldn't match. Working together, they developed a treatment plan that combined the best of both approaches. Rebecca used her stethoscope and medical instruments to accurately diagnose the child's condition, while Thunderbear prepared traditional remedies that could support respiratory function without interfering with Rebecca's medications. Most importantly, the Apache spiritual approach to healing created a supportive family environment that enhanced the medical treatment's effectiveness. "This is remarkable," Rebecca murmured, as they watched the infant's breathing become less labored after the combined treatment. "I've never seen traditional and modern medicine work together so effectively." "Because you have never worked with healers who understood both traditions," Thunderbear replied. "Most white doctors dismiss our medicine as superstition. Most Apache healers distrust white medicine as spiritual poison. But some of us have studied both paths." This revelation added another dimension to Rebecca's understanding of Thunderbear's character. He wasn't just a military leader or a grieving father. He was an intellectual who had spent years trying to understand the cultural forces that shaped the conflict between Apache and settler communities. His decision to bring 200 warriors to her clinic wasn't just about rescuing his son. It was part of a larger strategy to evaluate whether peaceful coexistence was possible. The healing circle's success attracted attention beyond the immediate Apache camp. By midday, riders were approaching from the direction of Copper Ridge. Territorial officials who had undoubtedly heard reports of the large Apache gathering and were coming to investigate. Rebecca watched their approach with growing dread, knowing that the delicate alliance she and Thunderbear were building could be shattered by the arrival of government authorities who saw only potential threats rather than opportunities for cooperation. "Military patrol," Miguel reported grimly. "Looks like territorial rangers, probably sent by the governor's office to assess the situation." Thunderbear had also observed the approaching riders, and his demeanor shifted subtly from collaborative healer back to military commander evaluating a potential threat. The Apache warriors throughout the camp responded to their chief's change in bearing, weapons appearing in hands that had moments before been helping with domestic tasks. "What will you tell them?" Thunderbear asked Rebecca directly. "These officials come because they fear what we represent together. Your answer will determine whether we continue building bridges or prepare for another war." Rebecca realized that she was about to face her second major test of cultural diplomacy. The Apache ceremony had established her credibility with Thunderbear's people, but now she needed to convince territorial authorities that the Apache encampment represented an opportunity rather than a threat. The challenge was complicated by the fact that her own position as an independent medical practitioner had always been somewhat precarious, with government officials who preferred clear chains of authority and jurisdiction. The patrol consisted of 6 territorial rangers led by Captain James Morrison, a career military officer whose rigid bearing and suspicious expression suggested someone more comfortable with clearly defined enemies than complex political situations. As he dismounted near Rebecca's clinic, his gaze took in the Apache camp with obvious alarm. "Dr. Mitchell," he said formally, using her professional title in a way that suggested both respect and wariness. "I'm Captain Morrison, Territorial Rangers. We've received reports of a large Apache gathering in this area. Can you explain the situation?" Rebecca chose her words carefully, knowing that her explanation would be reported to territorial authorities and could influence policy decisions that affected thousands of people. "The Apache war chief Thunderbear's son was injured during the tornado and brought to my clinic for medical treatment. Thunderbear came to retrieve his son and has remained to participate in collaborative healing work that benefits both Apache and settler communities." Captain Morrison's expression suggested skepticism about this optimistic interpretation. "Collaborative healing work with 200 Apache warriors? Dr. Mitchell, I think you may be underestimating the potential danger of this situation." "On the contrary," Rebecca replied with growing confidence, "I think you may be underestimating the potential opportunity. For the first time in decades, Apache and settler healers are working together to treat patients from both communities. The results have been remarkable." To demonstrate her point, Rebecca gestured toward the healing circle where Apache and settler families were receiving medical care side by side. White Dove was nursing her infant, whose breathing had dramatically improved thanks to the combined treatment approach. Mountain Cat's daughter was playing with other children despite her bandaged hand, which was healing cleanly under Rebecca's care. Most tellingly, Swift Running Water was moving around the camp with increasing mobility, his recovery accelerated by both medical treatment and the psychological boost of being reunited with his people. Captain Morrison studied the scene with the trained eye of someone accustomed to assessing military threats, but Rebecca could see his confusion as he tried to reconcile what he was observing with his preconceptions about Apache-settler relations. The children playing together, the families receiving medical care, and the obvious cooperation between communities painted a picture that didn't fit standard territorial policies for dealing with Native American populations. Thunderbear chose this moment to approach, his bearing dignified but non-threatening as he evaluated the territorial official who could determine the future of their experimental cooperation. "I am Thunderbear," he said in careful English. "My son was saved by the healer woman when the great wind brought him near death to her door. We remain to honor the spiritual debt this created and to explore whether our peoples can help each other instead of fighting." Captain Morrison's hand moved instinctively toward his sidearm, but he managed to control the reaction and maintain a professional demeanor. "War Chief Thunderbear, your reputation precedes you. I must ask about your intentions regarding the territorial settlements in this area. My intentions are to see my son fully healed and to understand what the spirits intended when they sent the tornado." Thunderbear replied evenly. "The healer woman has shown that some whites can be trusted. If territorial authorities can show the same wisdom, perhaps we can find new paths forward." The conversation that followed was unlike anything in the official diplomatic history between Apache tribes and territorial government. Instead of demands, ultimatums, and threats, both sides engaged in genuine discussion about mutual concerns and potential solutions. Captain Morrison expressed the settlers' fears about Apache raids and territorial expansion, while Thunderbear explained the Apache perspective on land rights, resource access, and cultural preservation. Rebecca found herself serving as an informal translator, not of languages, but of cultural concepts that each side struggled to understand. Her medical work had given her insights into both communities' genuine needs and concerns, positioning her to identify areas where cooperation might be possible despite decades of mutual hostility. What if we established formal protocols for this kind of collaborative healing work? Rebecca suggested during a lull in the discussion. Apache healers could work with territorial doctors to address medical needs that neither tradition can handle alone. It would provide practical benefits for both communities while creating regular opportunities for peaceful interaction. Captain Morrison looked intrigued despite his obvious reservations. Such an arrangement would require approval from territorial authorities and probably federal oversight as well. The legal complexities alone would be considerable, but not impossible, Thunderbear observed. Apache people have experience with treaty negotiations. If territorial officials are genuinely interested in peace rather than just conquest, we can find ways to formalize cooperation that benefits everyone. As the day progressed, what had begun as a tense confrontation evolved into something approaching actual negotiation. Captain Morrison agreed to report back to territorial authorities with a detailed account of the collaborative healing work and Thunderbear's proposals for formalized cooperation. Thunderbear committed to maintaining the current peaceful arrangement while territorial officials evaluated the situation. Most importantly, both sides acknowledged that Rebecca's clinic had demonstrated the possibility of Apache settler cooperation in ways that traditional diplomatic approaches had never achieved. The tornado that had initially threatened to destroy everything had instead created opportunities for understanding that might reshape the entire region's future. As evening approached and Captain Morrison prepared to depart with his patrol, Rebecca realized that she had become something she had never intended to be, a diplomatic bridge between two cultures that had been locked in conflict for generations. The responsibility was enormous, but so was the potential for positive change that could extend far beyond her small clinic in the Arizona desert. The fifth day brought with it a betrayal that Rebecca never saw coming, delivered not by enemies, but by those she had trusted most. Dawn was still breaking over the Apache camp when Miguel burst into her clinic, his weathered face pale with alarm and something that looked disturbingly like guilt. "Doctora, you must listen carefully and not ask questions until I finish," he said urgently, his hands shaking as he poured himself coffee with movements that spoke of barely controlled panic. "There are things I have not told you about my past, things that seemed unimportant until now. I was not just a trader among the Apache. For 15 years I worked as an informant for the territorial government, reporting on tribal movements and military capabilities." Rebecca felt the world tilt beneath her feet. Miguel had been her closest advisor, her cultural guide, her trusted friend throughout this entire crisis. The idea that he had been secretly working for territorial authorities while helping her navigate Apache relations was so shocking that for a moment she couldn't process the implications. "Last night I sent a coded message to my government contact," Miguel continued, his voice heavy with shame. "I reported everything: Thunderbear's military strength, the location of the camp, the success of your healing work, the diplomatic discussions with Captain Morrison. I thought I was helping prevent a larger war by keeping officials informed." "Miguel, what have you done?" Rebecca whispered. But even as she asked the question, she could see the answer in his stricken expression. "This morning, I received a reply. A full cavalry regiment is marching from Fort Bowie. 300 soldiers with artillery support. They will arrive by tomorrow evening with orders to disarm Thunderbear's warriors and escort all Apache back to reservation lands. There will be no more negotiations, no more collaborative healing, no more bridge building between our peoples." The magnitude of the disaster crashed over Rebecca like a physical blow. Everything they had accomplished, the successful medical collaboration, the diplomatic breakthrough with Captain Morrison, the growing trust between Apache and settler, Families was about to be destroyed by military intervention based on Miguel's intelligence reports. But worse than the political implications was the personal betrayal. Swift running water had just begun walking normally again. His recovery accelerated by being surrounded by his people and participating in the collaborative healing work. Thunderbear had started discussing long-term arrangements for formal cooperation between Apache healers and territorial doctors. Children from both communities were playing together as if cultural divisions had never existed. All of that would end when 300 cavalry soldiers arrived with orders to treat the Apache camp as a military threat rather than a diplomatic opportunity. "Why are you telling me this now?" Rebecca asked, though she dreaded the answer. Miguel's shame deepened visibly. "Because I have come to understand what we have built here and what will be lost when it is destroyed. Because I have watched Thunderbear's genuine efforts to find peaceful solutions, and I know the territorial authorities will never give diplomacy a real chance. And because you deserve the opportunity to warn your friends before the soldiers arrive." The ethical dilemma was staggering. If Rebecca warned Thunderbear about the approaching cavalry, she would be committing treason against territorial authorities. If she remained silent, she would be betraying people who had trusted her with their lives and their hopes for peace. Either choice would destroy relationships that had taken tremendous courage and sacrifice to build. But looking through her clinic window at swift running water, teaching Apache children a game he had learned from settler kids, Rebecca realized there was no real choice at all. She couldn't stand by and watch the destruction of something beautiful and unprecedented simply because warning her friends might be technically illegal. "How much time do we have?" she asked Miguel. 36 hours, maybe less if they push there. "Horses hard," he replied. "Enough time for Thunderbear to break camp and escape with his people, if that's what he chooses to do." Rebecca found Thunderbear where she had expected, in the healing circle, working with Apache and settler families to treat injuries and illnesses that had brought both communities together despite decades of mutual hostility. He was examining an elderly settler woman's infected leg wound while explaining to his own medicine man how Rebecca's antiseptic techniques could complement traditional Apache healing herbs. The scene embodied everything that would be lost when the cavalry arrived. Here was proof that Apache and settler communities could work together productively, that their different approaches to medicine and healing could strengthen rather than threaten each other, that children from both cultures could play and learn together without fear or prejudice. "Thunderbear," Rebecca said quietly, "I need to speak with you privately. It concerns the safety of your people." The war chief's expression shifted immediately from collaborative healer to military commander assessing a potential threat. He completed his examination of the settler woman's wound, gave instructions for her continued care to both Apache and white healers, then followed Rebecca to a spot where they could speak without being overheard. "What danger approaches?" he asked directly, his years of military leadership having taught him to recognize the signs of imminent crisis. Rebecca explained Miguel's revelation and the approaching cavalry regiment, watching Thunderbear's face harden as he processed the implications. She expected anger, accusations of betrayal, immediate orders for his warriors to prepare for battle or flight. Instead, Thunderbear was silent for a long moment, his gaze moving across the mixed community they had created over the past few days. "So the territorial authorities send soldiers to destroy what we have built here," he said finally. "They prefer the certainty of conflict to the uncertainty of peace." "I'm sorry," Rebecca said, feeling the inadequacy of words to address such a massive failure of human understanding. "I thought we were making real progress. I thought the collaborative healing work would demonstrate the possibilities for cooperation." Thunderbear's expression softened slightly. You have nothing to apologize for, healer woman. You have shown more courage in 5 days than most people show in a lifetime. The failure belongs to leaders who choose fear over hope. What will you do? Rebecca asked, dreading the answer but needing to know how this unprecedented experiment in Apache settler cooperation would end. Thunderbear looked again at the healing circle, where Apache and settler families continued working together in blissful ignorance of the approaching military intervention. There are several possibilities, he said slowly. We could break camp immediately and disappear into the desert before the soldiers arrive. We could prepare for battle and teach the cavalry that Apache warriors are not easily intimidated. Or, he paused, clearly considering options that Rebecca couldn't imagine. Or we could refuse to be driven apart by those who benefit from our conflict, Thunderbear continued. The healing work we have done here proves that our peoples can help each other. Perhaps it is time to make that cooperation permanent, regardless of what territorial authorities prefer. What Thunderbear proposed next was so audacious that Rebecca initially thought she had misunderstood his words. Rather than fleeing or fighting, he wanted to transform their temporary collaboration into something that couldn't be easily destroyed by military intervention. A permanent settlement where Apache and settler families could live and work together on a basis of mutual respect and shared benefit. You're talking about creating an entirely new kind of community, Rebecca said, trying to grasp the implications of such a radical idea. Something that's neither Apache reservation nor territorial settlement, but a genuine partnership between cultures. Exactly, Thunderbear confirmed. A place where Apache healers and white doctors work together, where our children learn from each other's traditions, where families from both peoples can build lives without fear of violence from either side. The concept was revolutionary, but Rebecca could see how it might work. The tornado had already demonstrated that natural disasters affected both communities equally, creating shared challenges that required collaborative solutions. The healing circle had proven that Apache and settler knowledge could complement each other in ways that benefited everyone involved. Most importantly, the children from both cultures had shown that racial and cultural divisions were learned behaviors rather than natural instincts. But how would such a community be established legally? Rebecca asked, her practical medical training making her consider the bureaucratic obstacles to such an unprecedented arrangement. Territorial law doesn't provide for mixed settlements, and federal Indian policy requires Apache families to live on designated reservation lands. Thunderbear smiled grimly. Laws can be changed when the people they govern demonstrate better alternatives. What we have built here in 5 days shows territorial authorities and Apache leaders alike that cooperation produces better results than conflict. If we can make this collaboration permanent, it becomes much harder for either side to return to the old patterns of mutual destruction. The plan that emerged from their discussion was complex but feasible. Thunderbear would divide his forces, sending most of his warriors back to traditional Apache territories with instructions to spread word about the successful collaboration at Rebecca's clinic. A smaller group, perhaps 50 people including families with children, would remain to establish the permanent settlement Thunderbear envisioned. Rebecca would use her medical credentials and growing reputation as a successful frontier doctor to petition territorial authorities for legal recognition of the settlement as a special medical district, where Apache and settler healers could work together to serve both communities. The collaborative healing work they had already demonstrated would provide evidence that such cooperation produced practical benefits that justified the unusual legal arrangements required. It's incredibly risky, Rebecca admitted as they refined the details. If territorial authorities refuse to recognize the settlement, everyone who stays could be arrested or forcibly relocated. If Apache leaders see this as abandoning traditional ways, your people could be cut off from tribal support and protection. All meaningful change involves risk, Thunderbear replied. The question is whether the risk of trying something new is greater than the risk of continuing old patterns that lead nowhere but mutual destruction. The decision couldn't be made by Thunderbear and Rebecca alone. It required the consent of every family that would be affected by staying to establish the permanent settlement. What followed was the most intense community discussion Rebecca had ever witnessed, conducted in a mixture of Apache and English, with swift running water serving as translator for concepts that didn't exist in both languages. The Apache families faced the difficult choice between traditional tribal life and an uncertain experiment in cross-cultural cooperation. They would be leaving behind the security of established Apache communities and the spiritual guidance of traditional leaders to participate in something that had never been attempted before. The settler families faced their own version of the same dilemma. Joining a mixed community would mean accepting Apache neighbors as equals, learning to respect cultural practices they didn't fully understand, and risking social ostracism from other territorial settlements that might view such cooperation as treason or betrayal. But the healing circle had created relationships that transcended cultural boundaries. Apache mothers had watched Rebecca save their children's lives with medical techniques that complemented traditional healing practices. Settler families had seen Apache healers provide treatments that territorial doctors couldn't match. Most powerfully, children from both communities had formed friendships that made their parents reconsider assumptions about the impossibility of peaceful coexistence. "My daughter plays with Apache children as if they were her own cousins," said Martha Henderson, one of the settler women whose infected wound had been successfully treated through collaborative medicine. "She's learning Apache words and teaching them English words, and they're all just children having fun together. Why should that end because adults have decided they have to be enemies? My son learns from the white healer woman and from our own medicine people," added White Dove, whose infant had recovered from pneumonia through combined Apache and settler treatments. "He grows stronger because he has knowledge from both traditions. Why should we make him choose between them?" The discussion continued through most of the day, with families weighing practical concerns against the unprecedented opportunity to create something genuinely new. By evening, a consensus had emerged, not unanimous, but strong enough to proceed. 47 people from both communities committed to staying and establishing the permanent settlement that Thunderbear and Rebecca had envisioned. As darkness fell over what would be their last night as a temporary collaboration, Rebecca realized that the tornado had indeed changed everything, but in ways that went far beyond anything she could have imagined when she first pulled swift running water from the debris. Tomorrow would bring the cavalry and a test of whether their radical experiment in cross-cultural cooperation could survive official opposition and skepticism. But tonight, Apache and settler families were planning a future together, and children from both communities were falling asleep to lullabies sung in languages they were all learning to understand. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they had already accomplished something remarkable. They had proven that the barriers between peoples were not as insurmountable as everyone had believed. The sixth dawn arrived, with the thunder of hoofbeats echoing across the desert floor as 300 cavalry soldiers crested the eastern ridge in perfect military formation. Colonel William Ashford led the regiment, his steel-grey moustache and ramrod-straight posture marking him as a career officer who had built his reputation on decisive action rather than diplomatic nuance. As the massive force deployed in battle, formation around Rebecca's clinic and the Apache settlement, the moment of truth had finally arrived. But what the cavalry found was not what their intelligence reports had prepared them for. Instead of a hostile Apache war camp threatening territorial settlements, they discovered something that defied every category in military protocols: a functioning, integrated community where Apache and settler families worked side by side in activities that looked more like a frontier town's daily life than a military encampment. Children from both cultures ran between the approaching soldiers and their parents, chattering excitedly in mixtures of Apache and English, about the impressive horses and uniforms. Apache women stood beside settler women, both groups tending to cooking fires and discussing the best treatments for various childhood ailments. Most remarkably, Apache warriors and settler men were collaborating on construction projects, building permanent structures that spoke of long-term settlement rather than temporary military positioning. Colonel Ashford reined in his horse near Rebecca's clinic, his expression revealing the confusion of a man whose tactical training had not prepared him for this situation. "Dr. Mitchell," he called out formally, "I am Colonel Ashford Fort Bowie. I have orders to disperse this Apache gathering and escort all tribal members back to designated reservation lands." Rebecca stepped forward, flanked by Thunderbear and Swift Running Water, who had insisted on being present for what everyone knew would be the decisive confrontation. "Colonel Ashford," she replied with a calm that surprised even herself, "I welcome you to Harmony Settlement, Arizona Territories, the first officially integrated medical community." The audacious claim was technically premature. Territorial authorities had not yet approved the legal status Rebecca and Thunderbear had petitioned for, but the confidence with which she made it gave Colonel Ashford pause. His orders had been based on reports of a potential Apache uprising, not a formal territorial settlement that claimed legal recognition. "Dr. Mitchell, I'm not sure what you think you've established here, but my orders are clear," Colonel Ashford replied, though his tone suggested uncertainty about how to proceed. "All Apache personnel are to be relocated to reservation boundaries. Immediately, Thunderbear stepped forward, his bearing dignified but non-threatening, as he addressed the colonel directly. "I am Thunderbear, war chief of the Chiricahua Band. Before you implement your orders, would you be willing to observe what we have built here? To see for yourself whether this community represents a threat or an opportunity?" What followed was the most unusual military inspection in frontier history. Colonel Ashford, accompanied by his senior officers and escorted by Thunderbear and Rebecca, conducted a systematic tour of Harmony Settlement that revealed the remarkable integration that had developed over just 6 days. The Healing Center had expanded beyond Rebecca's original clinic into a sophisticated medical facility where Apache medicine men worked alongside territorial doctors to treat patients from both communities. Traditional Apache herbal treatments were being carefully documented and tested in combination with modern medical techniques, producing results that neither tradition could achieve alone. This collaborative approach has reduced infant mortality by 60% compared to either community working independently, Rebecca explained, as they observed Apache and settler healers treating patients side by side. "We've successfully treated conditions that would have been fatal using either traditional or modern medicine alone." Colonel Ashford examined the detailed medical records Rebecca had maintained, his military mind recognizing the strategic implications of improved healthcare for frontier populations. "These results are impressive, Dr. Mitchell, but medical cooperation doesn't address the broader security concerns that brought me here." Thunderbear gestured toward the construction projects where Apache warriors and settler men were building permanent structures using techniques from both cultures. "Security comes from giving people reasons to protect rather than destroy," he replied. "When Apache families have homes and futures here, when settler families have Apache neighbors they know and trust, everyone has more to lose from conflict and more to gain from peace." The tour continued through the settlement's educational areas, where Apache children and settler children learned together in schools that incorporated both cultural traditions. Children were becoming fluent in both languages, while studying subjects that ranged from traditional Apache survival skills to territorial agricultural techniques. Most impressively, the economic cooperation had created prosperity that benefited everyone involved. Apache craftspeople were producing goods that territorial markets valued highly, while settler technical knowledge was improving Apache agricultural and construction capabilities. The settlement was becoming economically self-sufficient in ways that reduced dependence on both territorial government support and federal Indian assistance programs. "What you've created here is remarkable," Colonel Ashford admitted as the tour concluded, "but it's also unprecedented, and my orders don't provide for dealing with unprecedented situations." As the afternoon sun began its descent toward the western mountains, Colonel Ashford found himself facing a decision that would affect not just the immediate situation, but potentially the entire future of Apache settler relations throughout Arizona territory. His orders were clear: disperse the Apache gathering and escort tribal members back to reservation lands. But the reality on the ground challenged every assumption those orders were based on. Rebecca and Thunderbear had prepared for this moment by documenting everything they had accomplished and gathering testimonials from families whose lives had been improved by the collaborative community. Swift running water, now fully recovered from his tornado injuries, served as both translator and living symbol of what cross-cultural cooperation could achieve. "Colonel Ashford," Rebecca said formally, "I request that you delay implementation of your orders for 72 hours while I present our case to territorial authorities. What we've built here represents a new model for Apache settler relations that could prevent the conflicts your military forces exist to suppress. And I request," Thunderbear added, "that you report to your superiors that Apache people can be allies rather than enemies when treated with respect and given opportunities to contribute to territorial prosperity." Colonel Ashford studied the faces around him, Apache and settler families who had chosen to build something unprecedented together, children who had learned to see beyond racial and cultural divisions, healers who had discovered that cooperation produced better results than competition. His military training told him to follow orders without question, but his experience told him that some situations required flexibility and wisdom rather than rigid adherence to protocol. "Dr. Mitchell, War Chief Thunderbear," he said finally, "I am prepared to report to territorial authorities that the situation here requires diplomatic rather than military resolution. I will recommend a formal review of your settlement's legal status and a suspension of relocation orders pending that review." The relief that swept through the gathered crowd was palpable, but everyone understood that this was a temporary reprieve rather than a permanent solution. The ultimate fate of Harmony settlement would depend on territorial authorities who had never dealt with anything like it before. As Colonel Ashford's regiment departed with promises to carry detailed reports back to territorial and federal authorities, Rebecca found herself standing once again outside her clinic, looking out over a landscape that the tornado had transformed in ways that went far beyond physical destruction and reconstruction. Swift running water, fully healed and stronger than ever, had chosen to remain at Harmony Settlement as a bridge between Apache and settler communities. His recovery had become a symbol of what was possible when people chose cooperation over conflict, healing over harm. Thunderbear had made the momentous decision to establish his permanent residence at the settlement, bringing with him not just his immediate family, but also his authority as a war chief who could speak for Apache interests in negotiations with territorial officials. His presence guaranteed that Harmony Settlement would remain connected to broader Apache political networks while serving as a model for peaceful coexistence. Miguel, racked with guilt over his role as an informant, had chosen to dedicate himself completely to the settlement's success. His knowledge of both cultures and his connections with territorial authorities made him invaluable in navigating the complex legal and political challenges that lay ahead. Most importantly, the families who had chosen to stay, Apache and settler alike, were building lives together that their children would inherit. The tornado that had seemed like pure destruction had actually been the catalyst for creation, clearing away old assumptions and barriers to make room for something genuinely new. "Do you think it will work?" Swift Running Water asked Rebecca, as they watched Apache and settler children playing together in the evening light. "Do you think Harmony Settlement will survive and become what we dream it could be?" Rebecca considered the question carefully. The challenges ahead were enormous. Legal battles with territorial authorities, skepticism from both Apache and settler communities, the constant threat that fear and prejudice could undermine everything they had built. But looking at the integrated community that had emerged from tornado debris in just 6 days, she felt confident in her answer. "I think we've already proven it works," she replied. "Now we just have to prove it can last." The tornado had ended 6 days ago, but its true legacy was just beginning. In the years that followed, Harmony Settlement would become a model for Apache settler cooperation throughout the Southwest, demonstrating that the barriers between peoples were not as insurmountable as anyone had believed. Children who grew up speaking both languages and respecting both cultures would become leaders who carried the settlement's vision of cooperation into positions of influence throughout territorial and tribal governments. And it had all begun with one woman's simple decision to heal a wounded child, regardless of his race or the political complications his presence might create. Sometimes the most profound changes in human history start with the most basic acts of compassion, and sometimes a tornado's destruction is actually the wind of change that makes new growth possible. Rebecca Mitchell had saved Swift Running Water from a tornado, but in doing so, she had helped save the possibility of peace between two peoples who had almost forgotten they could be friends. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.